My recent videos about running a 12-volt refrigerator on a small portable power station didn't address an important question. What happens when the outside temperature gets hot, like it might when you're camping in the summer? This video addresses that with some actual testing, and I think you'll find the results interesting, and you'll see how incomplete information can lead you astray. Hi, I'm Gary, and I make videos about technology subjects that interest me, mostly from a user point of view. I published a couple of videos about my experiences trying to power my 12-volt fridge for 1 or 2 night camping trips using a small 300 watt-hour power station. My last video showed a lot of test data suggesting that it should work, given 2 conditions. 1, there was some sunshine for recharging with my small solar panels, and 2, the fridge energy use didn't go up too much if it was hot outside. Those results were accurate, but since all of my testing had to be done at room temperature, because it's winter in Idaho, that left a big unanswered question. What happens when it's hot? It's obvious that a fridge will use more energy for cooling when it gets hotter, but how much more? And is it enough to wreck my cheapskate plan? Yeah, it probably is, as you will see. I still haven't found any actual data about this online. That's not really surprising, because that kind of testing is expensive or time-consuming or boring or all of the above. And energy use depends on how cold you want it, how hot it is outside, and maybe the phase of the moon for all I know. The manufacturers typically don't specify energy efficiency because it's complicated, and because you probably wouldn't like the results if they gave them to you. I ran into the same problem when I was trying to decide whether to replace my RV refrigerator a couple of years ago. No data. So this video is about my attempt to find an answer, at least for my Iceco JP40 fridge, which I think is more or less representative of the breed. It uses a German-made Seekop compressor, which is apparently used by a number of other brands as well. The manual only specifies the power draw when running as 60 watts, which tells you nothing about energy use, because the compressor only runs when it needs to, in order to maintain the set temperature. If you just want to know what the results of all this are, you can skip over what's coming next, but I really have to talk about how to do this. Test results aren't meaningful unless the test conditions are well defined and consistent. Doing this at the manufacturer level would typically involve the use of a very expensive temperature-controlled chamber and a computerized multi-channel data acquisition system, neither of which I have. Several people offered helpful suggestions after my last video about how to test the fridge, and I appreciate that. There were some good ideas there. Since I'm doing this mostly for my own edification, I couldn't justify spending as much money as the fridge cost just for this project. So here you have the shoestring approach to refrigerator testing. 3 main issues had to be addressed. 1, finding a space that could be heated up without heating my whole house to 100 degrees, as well as some way to heat that space to the desired temperature and maintain that temperature for hours at a time. And finally, acquiring data on how much power and energy the fridge uses as the temperature varies. Problem number 1 was the hardest one in some ways, because I've lived in my house for 45 years, and there's pretty much no unused space in it. But I found an under-counter space in the basement that was big enough to hold the fridge, with some room around it for air to circulate. I lined it with foam board on the front, back, and bottom, hoping that this would contain the heat well enough to let me get it up to 100 degrees or so. And indeed it did. Actually heating it up didn't go as planned, however. I was too lazy to do actual heat loss calculations, so I scaled down a number I found online for heating a whole house. That suggested only 30-something watts was needed to do the job. So I bought a $10 heater that was supposed to produce 100 watts and connected it to a power supply through an $8 temperature controller. both from Amazon. As it turned out, all these cheap DC heaters have built-in over-temperature limiting to keep them from starting fires, so it only produced 25 watts without a lot of fan cooling. But it didn't really matter because that just wasn't enough heat anyway. Even at 60 watts, it only raised the temperature of my enclosure about 4 to 5 degrees. So, on to Plan B. By adding a $6 relay to the temperature controller, I could use a 250-watt heat lamp as my heater, and that did the trick. With a small computer fan to circulate the air, it heated up my enclosure to 100 degrees Fahrenheit in less than an hour and held it fairly constant. Acquiring the data without an automated data system meant I had to do things the hard way. I do have 4 standalone temperature data loggers, which you can't buy from Amazon anymore, unfortunately. So I could measure temperature in the enclosure and at 3 locations inside the fridge. This let me see how the fridge was cooling and also when the compressor was running. Its cycle is around an hour long, so the energy use needs to be calculated over complete cycles to get accurate results. To measure power and energy, I plan to use the DC watt meter I purchased for my previous video. That plan crashed when it quit working just as I was starting the testing. Possibly because I may have connected it backwards, I'm not sure. Somewhat to my surprise, PowerWorks agreed to replace it under warranty. I was really impressed with their customer service. I did buy another cheap Chinese one from Amazon to use in the interim, though. The problem is, this is only a meter. It has no output other than the display. Rather than sit and record readings manually for hours or days, I elected to use time-lapse photography to record the watt meter readings, along with a timer and occasional readings from the temperature loggers that are storing up data at the rate of once a minute. Actual testing is the easy part. Now all that data has to be analyzed. When a test is done, the data loggers have to be exported to Excel spreadsheets, and the watt meter readings manually entered into Excel by stepping through the time-lapse videos, frame by frame. Once you get all 5 of these data sources time synchronized in Excel, you can get a fairly detailed picture of energy use as it's affected by temperature and how the fridge is performing. But boy, is that a lot of manual labor. Each test takes several hours in order to be sure of stable operation at each test condition. In fact, I wound up with over 200 hours of test data, although I certainly didn't analyze it all. Good thing I'm retired. I occasionally opened the fridge for a couple of minutes to see what effect this had on energy use. That was tricky because I only left a small removable panel in my enclosure to reach inside. For reference, almost all of this testing was done with the fridge thermostat at 27 degrees Fahrenheit, where I normally use it. The fridge contained a couple of gallons of water in its compartments, and I cooled it down in advance. I had 1 temperature sensor monitoring the outside air temperature next to the fridge. The other 3 were inside. One was in what I call the vegetable area, the separate space at the top that only gets sort of cool. As you'll see, this is not safe for any food that might spoil, but it's handy for drinks. A second sensor was inside one of my bottles of water to measure the temperature of the fridge contents, which is really the important thing to know. And the third one hung in the air near the bottom of the fridge to measure how cold the inside air was while the compressor cycled on and off. So here's what I tried to find out with this testing. The main question is, how much is the fridge energy use affected by the outside ambient temperature? And will it still operate okay when it's really hot? How much is energy use affected by opening the fridge to get something out of it? And how much does energy use vary with the fridge thermostat setting? Finally, I was curious to see if the fridge actually uses less energy in its eco mode. It took over a week to get the data, so it's taken much longer than I hoped for what seemed like fairly simple questions. But here's what I learned. First, let's look at fridge energy use versus temperature. The easiest way to show the results of this is a graph. I warn you, there are going to be a bunch of graphs in this video because I like graphs and I spent a lot of time making them, so you get to see them whether you want to or not. But don't get hung up on the details. There are typically only one or two important bits of information on each one. Most of them will look like this one, with the temperatures measured by my 4 sensors plotted against time. As a reminder, the top curve is the ambient temperature around the fridge, which is normally inside my poor man's temperature chamber. And the lower 3 curves are the temperatures at 3 different locations inside the fridge. This graph is just an example. It shows that it takes about 12 hours for the fridge to cool down to a really stable temperature. Now let's look at some data that's actually interesting. If you saw my previous video on this subject, you may remember that I found the fridge used about 11 watts on average in eco mode at a 70-degree room temperature. As a consistency check, I repeated that testing with the fridge both in and out of my temperature chamber. Just sitting on the floor at about 68 degrees, it averaged a bit over 10 watts, and in the chamber at 71 to 72 degrees, it used just over 12 watts. Those values seem reasonable compared to before. I should point out here that the power the fridge uses varies continuously, which is why it has to be averaged over complete compressor cycles. A typical cycle is about an hour long, and the power usage looks like this. So how do you determine the average power of that? Since it's really energy use we're interested in, you just take the energy consumption over some period and divide it by the time to get average power. As long as that time is an integral number of compressor cycles, it should give you a pretty good result for the test conditions you're at. However, there are a couple different ways to do this. The brute force way is to dig the numbers out of the raw data and calculate it directly. Doing it that way for this 70-degree test gives an average power of 12.16 watts. The other way is just to dump the values onto a graph and let Microsoft Excel plot a trend line on it, like this. The slope of the trend line is energy used in watt-hours per day, which in this case gives an average power of 12.04 watts. Not precisely the same, but a tenth of a watt difference is plenty good enough for my purposes. If you do the same thing for the 80-degree eco mode test, you get 14.9 watts as a direct calculation, versus 15 watts if you let Excel do it. Close enough. I'll spare you any more calculations and jump to the real question, which is how much more power and energy does the fridge use as it gets hotter outside? This shows the fridge behavior for eco mode operation at 4 increasing temperatures. The hottest test is at 109 instead of 110 degrees because my temperature chamber just wouldn't go any hotter without a bigger heater. Here's the energy use graph from that test, and it's obvious that the fridge uses much more power as it gets hotter. So the numbers I showed in my last video were correct, but my conclusions were very optimistic. A polite way of saying wrong, unless you only use the fridge around 70 degrees. It uses about twice as much power at 100 degrees, for example. The good news is that the fridge goes right on working at over 100 degrees. I averaged the temperature curves to make it easier to see what it's doing. The temperature in the upper part of it is going up steadily as the outside temperature increases. So that area of the fridge may not be too useful. But the main chamber is remarkably stable, even at 109 degrees. The temperatures are starting to wobble a good bit up there, so it may be nearing its limit. But if it gets hotter than that, I'd feel lucky it's working at all. On to question 2. How much is the energy use affected by opening the fridge? That's a lot harder to measure with it stuck inside my temperature chamber. But I made myself a little door to poke my arm through and opened the fridge lid. I did that for a couple of minutes several times at different temperatures. At 70 and 90 degrees, there's very little change in the fridge behavior, except sometimes in the upper vegetable area. At 100 degrees, where you would expect a bigger effect, it still amounted to less than half a watt-hour for each time it was opened. I did one more try during the 80-degree test, leaving the lid open for 3.5 minutes, taking a bottle of water out and putting in a bottle of water at room temperature. Still, the result was that the fridge used about a half a watt-hour of extra energy on the next compressor cycle. So my conclusion is that if you don't open the fridge any more than necessary, and you don't put warm food in it while it's cold, you don't have to worry that much about using a lot more energy. Question 3. How much does energy usage vary with the fridge thermostat setting? For my own use, I hardly ever change the thermostat, so I only did one test at 70 degrees in eco mode, where I lowered the thermostat from my usual 27 degrees down to 21 degrees. You can see that the average power went up from 12 watts to 14.3, which is almost a 20% increase just to cool it down 6 more degrees. But I'm happy with where I normally use it, so I don't really care. And the final question is, does the fridge actually use less energy in the eco mode compared to the max mode? It always turns on in max mode, so you have to deliberately switch it to eco mode if you want to use it that way. I'll spare you all the rest of the beautiful graphs I produced just for this one question and jump right to the results. Yes, eco mode does indeed use less power. Something in the range of 15 to 25% less. I don't know why there's so much variation in the results, but I'm fairly confident these are at least in the right ballpark. So there you have it. I did learn one more interesting thing from all this testing. A couple of times I turned off the fridge at the end of a test just to see how fast it warmed up. It depends to some extent on where you are in the compressor cycle when it turns off, but the results still surprise me a bit. The rough rule of thumb for refrigeration is that you should keep foods that can spoil below 40 degrees to be safe. When the ambient temperature was 70 degrees, it took about 4 hours before the inside temperature warmed up to 40. But at 80 degrees ambient, it only took slightly over 1 hour. That maybe suggests that my 12-volt fridge is not terribly well insulated, which doesn't seem to agree with its good operating efficiency. Obviously, I don't intend to use it without power, but it's still worthwhile to know. Anyway, there it is, the whole shebang, so to speak. I apologize for all those graphs, but it was a lot of data to present in however long this video turns out to be. I will try not to make a habit of this in future videos. And to reevaluate the question from my previous video, I was simply wrong. I don't believe it is possible to get 2 full days of fridge operation from a 300-watt portable power station, even with a fair amount of solar recharging, unless the weather's pretty cool. And I don't like cold weather camping. Fortunately, this whole adventure has left me owning not 1 but 3 portable power stations, so I'm not compelled to invest in a bigger one. If you have hung on until the end of this video, thank you very much for watching. I'd be happy to hear any comments or feedback on this whole business. And if you did enjoy it, please leave a like for the video. See you in the next one, I hope.